economy of our community. It's a wonderful opportunity, and I hope that throughout the country people will look at that section and see whether it might illuminate a possibility for generating a local economy in new ways through associations. Now, the other way of building a local economy is obviously through the local institutions.
And we should say at least a word about that, because it seems to us that if the principle is still going to be followed, that you start in all community building activities by looking at what's already there, right, and seeing what you've got, and that our constant finding is that when you do that, when you change the glasses to see what we've got, there's always more there than you think. One of the clear ways that we're discovering that this is true is when people take another look at the institutions that are already in their neighborhood. I'm not talking now about institutions that are usually thought about as economic, right? I'm talking about parks and schools and libraries and police and all of the sort of normal institutions that don't usually get thought about in terms of their economic power. But if you think about them in economic terms, all of a sudden you've got a whole new set of resources. A little graphic that illustrates a few of the possibilities for mobilizing and using the economic resources of non-economic institutions, right? We think about schools as places that educate children. We think about parks as places that do recreation, and police provide protection. Let's think about them in terms of their economic functions and their economic potentials. And this is simply the beginning of a list. We are now finding that if you look in your institutional base in every community, that all of our institutions buy a lot of stuff, right? Think of all the stuff that a school buys and that the police department buys. If you started saying which of those kinds of items for purchase could be purchased locally, right? What do we already have in the community in terms of businesses that could sell to the institutions in our neighborhood? They don't have to go hundreds of miles away. They don't even have to go to another neighborhood to buy a lot of what they're already buying. They hire people. All of our institutions hire people, and we're finding, in fact, that an awful lot of the work that institutions do could be done by local people, that there are lots of skills, that if you began to do a skills bank and match them with local institutional needs, you'd find an awful lot of folks who, in fact, could do some of the work locally. Creating new businesses. Do you remember in the first program we talked a little bit about Lucy Flower High School, about that high school, that wonderful high school that was creating businesses for their young people to begin to experience the world of business and make money at the same time? Well, one of the things that they did was they asked themselves, what are we buying? And if we can't buy it in the neighborhood, why don't we start a business that allows us to purchase from the business? So there's all kinds of business startup possibilities if we look at what our local institutions already buy. Again, in Lucy Flower, we saw a wonderful example of sort of the institution developing the human capacity so that those young people, remember the young man working in the shop who was thinking already of himself as an accountant, right? He had his future all mapped out, right? And he knew exactly where he was going because that sort of opportunity was there for him. We're seeing service learning projects coming up throughout the United States. We're seeing the kinds of things, Barbara, that you're involved with young people doing all kinds of work in businesses and in community groups and sort of preparing themselves for the world of work. Lots of communities have institutions that have an interest in developing the physical resources of the neighborhood, right? When you think about, in a lot of our neighborhoods, all of the abandoned buildings, all of the vacant land, all of the dilapidated infrastructure, right? One of the major sets of opportunities is to say, what can we do with that? What can we do with those physical resources to turn them around, to make them productive once again, to do community gardens and farms, to turn the transit stations into opportunities for development? So that's being done by communities across the United States. And then everybody who runs an institution in a local neighborhood has usually, at some points in their cycle of yearly financing, some money to invest. What if they would do that all locally, right? In the local nations bank, or in the local credit union, or in the local vehicle, which in fact is a local investment kind of vehicle. And what if, in fact, if you don't have a local investment vehicle, those institutions would get together and begin to form one, begin to think about what would you need to make credit flow into this neighborhood once again. And then finally, every institution in the neighborhood, or many of them, particularly public institutions, have relationships with downtown or with places that are bigger than they are, right? And they can be bridges to those resources. They can allow the neighborhood to be able to think in broader terms about the resources that can be coming into this neighborhood. So they are valuable as sort of ways to contact and make relationships with the outside world. And we'll be talking about those kinds of relationships a lot more later on in this program. So that's just a beginning list of what institutions can do. Now, the other thing you'll find in the Green Book, in the guide, on pages 293 to 310 is a little section that in fact talks about the kinds of institutions that provide in a community the lifeblood that credit represents. If you can't borrow in a community, if nobody's investing in that community, you don't have the financial wherewithal to do a lot of the things that the community wants to do. So we've been particularly interested in the CDFIs, the Community Development Financial Institutions, that have a direct kind of control and sight in the neighborhoods. We've been particularly interested in the small ones, like the Community Development Credit Union movement, and all of the tools that puts at people's hands to get credit back into their neighborhoods. So that, too, is a really important part of what building a community economy is about. Now, there's so much more to be said about the economy, and we just don't have the time tonight to do it. But I thought it would be good to sort of end this segment by listening to one of the people from whom we've learned an awful lot about how to think creatively about the community economy. You remember we've visited before the west side of Chicago and Bethel New Life, and you know about their work. Let's listen for just a moment to one of the most creative economic development voices in communities in America. This is the president of Bethel New Life, Mary Nelson, talking about the way in which she sort of approaches this idea of economic development and some of the tactics that they've tried. Here's Mary.
Bethel sort of evolved in looking at the assets of the community, and obviously geographically there's some interesting ones. But most importantly, when we began to look at the assets of the community, we saw two things. One is that we are right next to the city's incinerator plant, and there's a lot of fly dumping going around here, so there's a lot of garbage in this community. And we saw then that garbage could be a real asset, and began to get into recycling and in the environmental kinds of things in terms of looking for ways to develop jobs in the community. And the other asset was a lot of elderly people. And with the graying of America and the service economy kind of notion, services to elderly then, because we have a lot of good caregivers in this community, a lot of people who've been already caring for their neighbors and their grandmas and their aunties and so forth, and who could then be about this business of caring for the elderly on a cost-effective basis. So those are the two sort of other kinds of assets that we discovered as we were looking for ways to build jobs in the community. So we've begun marketing the vacant industrial land around here to companies that are in recycling, remanufacturing, and the one I love to talk about is the one that may be coming in very soon. They've made a commitment, and they take old diapers, baby diapers, and they wash them, the disposable kind. They wash them and they take the plastic off, and what's left is a pulp that's a really good pulp and cost-effective pulp for high-grade paper. A good example, but a whole variety of kinds of recycling, remanufacturing companies. So you walk down a road and you don't know where it's going to lead you, but this has the prospect now of 400 new jobs in our community and of a career ladder in the environmental careers that really does lead to livable wage jobs.
So there's Mary Nelson talking about, I think, the wonderfully creative process that they've engaged in of finding, where nobody else saw them, a whole set of economic development assets, right? What did she list? She listed vacant land, she listed diapers, she listed all of the older folks in the community. All of those things then are thought about as economic development materials, and I think she does a wonderful job at that.
We're now at the place where we want to think about how you can put all three pieces together with the economy underneath so that we have a whole community plan being developed. And in order for us to be able to do that, I think there are two cautions. And the first is, not every community, I think, is ready or should start by saying, we'll put it all together. We'll get all our assets and get them in line. In many communities, I think the thing we need to do is extend what we're already doing, but to begin to move away from needs and move toward assets. A second caution is that developing a whole community plan means you're serious about involving everybody, but you're also serious through time. This is not something that you're going to do in 2 years. Community development that is asset-based is serious business, and it's a decade. It's a 2-decade. In fact, it is a continuing process. So with those cautions, let's move ahead and think about how we can put these pieces together.
I do think also we should say at the beginning that as we're sort of talking a little bit about each of these 5 steps, it occurs to us that when we see them actually happening in communities, they're all happening at once. That is, none of them are steps that you do once, it's done, and you move on then and do some. So those of us with linear and sequential minds are always in trouble, right, in these community processes. We have to get more circular about our processes. But I think where we want to start is to take just a moment and to say that the critical first step, if you're going to do long-term, serious community planning, is to think about what we've been calling the table and setting the table. John, is there a table here?
There is.
We're going to set the table for a moment. And what we're going to suggest is that it is very important in the community planning process to think about who's at the table in the inner circle and who's sort of involved and very important, but kind of at one remove in an outer circle. And I think what we want to suggest, and we see it in our friends in Dudley Street and Roxbury, and we see it in a number of other stories that we'll be telling in a moment, that the critical elements of the community planning process are the associations, are the places where citizen power and energy comes together without getting paid. So it's the churches, it's the block clubs, it's the athletic teams and leagues, right? It's the cultural groups, it's the places where folks are coming together to do the work together of community building, as de Tocqueville reminded us years and decades ago. It's those groups that we need at the center of our process, right? We also need the institutions, the triangles there, but they're at the outer ring at this point because those systems and institutions, and we all have one foot in them too, right? Because they are so powerful and because they have so many resources, if they come to the table first, what we find over and over again is that their own institutional agendas will begin to dominate what gets talked about at the community table. So it's so important to emphasize that the circles go around the table. I want to spend just a moment now on the building of the table. And I've asked our colleagues here in the studio to think a little bit about their own neighborhoods and to suggest very briefly one citizens association in their neighborhoods that they would be absolutely clear had to be at the table. If this was a serious neighborhood planning table that you were setting, who has to be there from your neighborhood? Let's just start and we'll collect them. And John, you can put them up there.
Well, the community action group associated with my church provides training and job opportunities for homeless people and with people with addictions.
Okay, so they bring all kinds of interests in the housing questions and,
yes,
and a variety of citizens' approaches to the agencies and services. Great, okay.
In my neighborhood, we have a very strong neighborhood association called the Stanton Park Neighborhood Association.
Yes, and if there's an association already there, they've got to be at the center of this process. Dr. Mays?
Well, I think it's imperative to include our local PTA council at the table because they're concerned with youth and their education.
Absolutely, and it's the parent's voice, and the parent's voice needs to be at the table.
Again, but getting back to economics, your local chambers of commerce bring kind of that perspective and cover the business assets and resources.
So the associations of businesses, the tables that the businesses come together and think about their role in the community. Terrific, absolutely.
I think you need youth fraternities there.
You bet. We need the strong youth voice. We've seen it in Dudley Street. It's one place, but all over the place. Where there's a strong youth voice, there's a lot more life at that table. Absolutely, Bernard. Thanks.
Because our group would deal with the issue of safety, I think we definitely need a neighborhood watch group.
A neighborhood watch group, absolutely. And probably more than one. All of them we can find, because clearly safety is important. Absolutely.
As well as a recreational type of group like a softball league.
Absolutely. Yeah. Communities are places where people play as well as work. Absolutely. We need those folks at the table. Barbara?
I think one of the active groups are Boys and Girl Scout troops, which involve the parents and the youth. They're very active in organizations.
Terrific. Terrific. Well, we've got a list then here of 8 various citizens associations, all of whom bring a different lens